Hello, students. Today, what we're going to cover is strategic leadership. This chapter actually sets up some of the key terms and definitions that we are going to cover throughout the semester. You're going to learn what the definition is of strategy. You're going to understand what the formal definition is of competitive advantage. And we are going to learn what the typical steps are that are involved in the strategy making process, and then what parties in firms are typically responsible for developing and for implementing strategy. So I'm going to go ahead and start, and I'm going to start with going over some of the key terms that are going to be important for you to understand for this chapter. The first definition that you're going to want to make sure that you know both for this course and your quizzes, and then just in general, is this word strategy. When we think of strategy, we think of people who are in charge of firms doing something that plans for what the future will be for that firm, and then that's part of it. But your formal definition is going to be strategy is a set of related actions that managers take to increase their company's performance. So it's the set of related actions that managers take to increase their company's performance. And when we say managers, we actually specifically mean general managers. Any other managers in a firm are going to be responsible for implementing strategy that they have been delegated from the general managers, who are the ones that are responsible for a firm. So a set of related actions that managers take to increase their company's performance. That's important because strategy is always intended to increase a company's performance. It's not just an activity that is useful for planning and writing things down. The specific goal is to increase a company's performance. Strategic leadership is when competitive advantage, and we'll talk about the formal definition for that in just a bit, but when competitive advantage is created through effective management and the strategy making process. So strategic leadership is when competitive advantage is created through effective management of the strategy making process. Some other key terms that I want you to understand as we're talking about firm performance is the notion of shareholder value. Shareholders, and we're going to talk about stakeholders later, so I want to make sure you don't confuse stakeholders and shareholders conceptually. Shareholders, you can think of them as owners of the firm. These are going to be individuals and sometimes perhaps firms that own an interest in a firm. Shareholder value is a way that we can measure the performance of a firm. And shareholder value, very specifically, are returns that shareholders earn from purchasing shares in a company. So returns that shareholders earn from purchasing shares in a company. So when you look at the stock market, when a firm is performing well in the stock market and shareholders are earning a return, then that implies, and it's typically the result of a firm performing well. The general managers being effective stewards of the strategy making process. And so therefore it has resulted in shareholder value, which is a way we can measure superior performance of a firm. Risk capital is a concept that I want you to understand as well. Shareholders are really important in business and in strategy because they provide this equity capital with no guarantee of return. So they give resources to a firm in order for them to invest, in order for them to grow. And so risk capital is equity capital that's invested with no guarantee that stockholders are going to recoup their cash or earn a decent return. And so when we begin to talk about the notion of stakeholders, and I'll go ahead and introduce the definition to you now, stakeholders are any individual or group that can be affected by or that can affect a firm. And I'll say that again. Stakeholders are any individual or group that can be affected by or that can affect a firm. When we talk about stakeholders, that's a really broad group or a broad set of different entities and individuals. And shareholders oftentimes are the most prioritized group of stakeholders, because they are the ones that took the risk of providing this equity capital without any guarantee of recouping their cash or earning a decent return. And firm general managers want to make sure that shareholders are happy so that they will continue to provide this risk capital. And this is why you'll often see them as the most prioritized stakeholder group. Just some other foundational terms I want to go over with you is just the notion of profitability. So profitability is going to be the return that a company makes on capital invested in the enterprise. So a return a company makes on the capital invested in the enterprise. I know that if you are an accounting major, then you're going to think of profit as revenue minus expenses. And so you can conceive of it that way, because when you think of profitability, it's going to be revenues that are in excess of whatever capital was utilized in order to engage in those operations for the business. So profitability, the return a company makes on the capital invested on the enterprise. Return on invested capital is actually a formula by which we can assess the superior performance of a firm. And then what you do with that is that you take the net profit that a firm makes and then you divide it by the capital invested in a company. And then what you get is return on invested capital. And what that does is it shows how well the capital has been used to satisfy customer needs by the general managers of a firm. So just some key terms that we've gone over, and just to recap, and I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can see on my PowerPoint some of these concepts. Is shareholder value, our returns that shareholders earn from purchasing shares in the company. Risk capital, this is this equity capital invested with no guarantee that the stockholders are going to earn a decent return or recoup their cash. Remember, I talked about this is why shareholders often are the most prioritized stakeholder group. And just to go over stakeholders again, I don't have a slide for that right now. We'll go over stakeholders when we cover corporate social responsibility later on in the semester. But stakeholders are any individual or group that can be affected by or that can affect a firm. And so that would include customers, it would include employees, and it would also include shareholders. It would include the society where the firm is located. It would include a lot of different, it would include lots of individuals, and it would include lots of different groups. And shareholders are one of those groups. Profitability. Profitability is the return a company makes on the capital that's invested in the enterprise. That would encompass the typical accounting concept of profitability, which is going to be revenues minus expenses. And the return on invested capital is a very specific formula that we can use to assess the performance of a firm, to determine the performance of a firm. And then that is net profit divided by capital invested in a company. So there are different ways that managers can achieve profit growth. And you can look at this later. I think that these are all rational. Obviously, if you expand your market, you're going to see some profit growth. And in order for you to achieve, we're going to talk about this in just a little bit, sustainable competitive advantage, and you're going to consistently want to seek to achieve profit growth as opposed to just achieving profit each year or profitability each year. Here's what I really want to get to, because we're going to talk about this definition throughout our semester. And I really want to make sure that you guys understand it and that you're not using the vernacular that we typically use when we refer to competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is when a company's profitability is greater than the average profitability of firms in its industry. So it's when a company's profitability is greater than the average profitability of firms in its industry. So I know that typically when you think of competitive advantage, you'll think of it as a firm doing something better than another firm, or when a firm has got some sort of leverage in terms of, oh, I've got more efficient personnel, or I've got better brand recognition. And then all of these are things, and we'll talk about things like distinctive competencies. We'll even talk about resources that can lend themselves to achieving competitive advantage, and capabilities also that can lend themselves to firms achieving competitive advantage. But those are not competitive advantage themselves. Competitive advantage exists when a company's profitability is greater than the average profitability of firms in its industry. And this is the result of the effective strategy management process of general managers of a firm. So make sure you remember that this is the definition of competitive advantage: not being able to do something better than another firm, not being able to have a more customers, because remember, that doesn't always result in profitability, not having better brand recognition. All these things can lend themselves to competitive advantage. But competitive advantage is something that is measurable, and you can observe it on a profit and loss statement, and you can compare it to other firms' profit and loss statements, and then you'll know if you have it. So I want you to understand that. So competitive advantage occurs when the company's profitability is greater than the average profitability of firms in its industry. And then ideally firms, so that they can survive, and we're going to talk about the industry life cycle later, so that they can have a longer period of time that they exist in the industry life cycle. Then they want to have sustainable or sustained competitive advantage. And this is simply when a company's strategies enable it to obtain above average profitability for a number of years. So it's when you have competitive advantage for a number of years. Business model. This is extremely important because your business model is usually what lends itself to a firm being able to effectively achieve competitive advantage. And that's why it's so important when I talk about it in entrepreneurship. I want you to write your business model, write your vision, make it plain, tell us who you are, who your customers are. Make it clear what the processes are that you intend to implement in order for you to be whatever business you are, right? A business model is basically the conception of how, it's a manager's conception. I want you to think of it this way. It's a general manager's conception of how the strategies of a firm should work together as a whole to achieve competitive advantage. So it is you selecting a specific type of product with specific characteristics, with strengths, utilizing the strengths that you have and the resources that you have, and you distributing them in a certain way to certain customers in a manner that is based upon either the distinctiveness of that particular product or your cost efficiency activities, ways to reduce your costs, right? The bottom line is a business model explains who a firm is, what they do, how they do it, even to some extent why they do it. But it's a conception of how all of the strategies for a firm should work together as a whole in order for a firm to achieve competitive advantage. And just as I stated, it's going to talk about how you select, acquire, and keep your customers, who they are, how you get them, how you keep them. It's going to differentiate your products from your competitors. It's going to make it clear what you offer and why your products are different. It's going to talk about how you organize your resources and your activities. We talked about distribution, et cetera. And then it's going to really create a clear explanation of what it is that you do in order for you to achieve competitive advantage, achieve it and sustain, ideally, high profitability. So I really want you to think of two main types of managers. So you want to think of general managers, and these are going to be ones that are going to bear the responsibility for guiding a firm. They're going to be responsible for its overall performance or for the performance and the strategy of one of maybe a multi-divisional firm's strategic business units. We'll talk about that, but they would be the CEO of a firm, the CFO of a firm. They're going to be responsible for chief operating officer, chief financial officer, and chief executive officer are going to be responsible for a company's overall performance. The same thing would happen, let's just say, if you are in a firm that's got multiple business units. We could think of a large firm like Procter & Gamble. So if they have one that's over a house, have someone that's in charge of their household products division, they might not be the CEO of Procter and Gamble, but they are directly responsible for the strategy making and the overall performance of that household products division, all of its different products and activities. And so they would also be a general manager. Then what you have is a functional manager. Functional managers are responsible for the functional activities of a firm. So you can think of marketing, human resources, finance, accounting, uh, maybe production, manufacturing, research and development. They're very important, but they typically are responsible for implementing the strategy that has been delegated and articulated to them by general managers. So they are responsible for supervising a particular function, task, activity, or operation, and for strategy implementation. General managers are largely responsible for strategy development and oversight. In a multi-divisional company, and we're going to talk about this in subsequent chapters when we talk about diversification, but a multi-divisional company, very simply, is one that competes in several different, has several different businesses. And each one of those different businesses has its own self-contained organizational structure. So a company, a multi-divisional company can be one that is that competes in, it could be in the same industry even, all of their different divisions, but they're going to have different businesses or different business units, and we'll talk about this. So you could think of, let's just think of Procter and Gamble having a household cleaning products division, and then having a commercial cleaning products division. Both of those divisions are making products that are in the same industry, but they could still be separate business units. And whomever is in charge of those different business units would be the general managers for those different business units. I also want you to think of there being 3 levels of a firm. I know that these things are on the test, and right now what I'm doing is I know what is on your test because I've helped create it. I've created it for you. So I want you to know what the 3 levels are of strategic management. You can think of this as the 3 levels of a firm. And what you're going to have is you're going to have your corporate level, you're going to have your functional level, and then you're going to have your business level. And I guess you could, let's just put it in order the way that you typically see it in the way that a firm operates. You're going to have your corporate level, you'll have your business unit or your divisional level. Sometimes business unit level will be interchanged in your textbook even, and then in some of the other readings that you will be exposed to for divisional. So when we talk about the business unit level or the business level or the divisional level, we're all talking about the same thing. And then you'll have the functional level. At the corporate level, of course, you'll have your CEO, your board of directors, your corporate staff, those that are in charge of developing and oversight for strategy. Then at your business level, you also have people who are both responsible. Well, let me say this. They're responsible for developing strategy for their specific business unit. These general managers are going to be here developing strategy for their specific business unit, but then also implementing the overall strategy for the firm. And then at the functional level is when you're going to have the managers who are responsible for specific functions of a firm. Functions of a firm will be really value chain functions, like all of the different functions that are responsible for transforming an input into an output. That's what the value chain is. So that would be your product development team, your marketing team, your human resources, your finance, accounting, et cetera, as I went over earlier. So there are 3 levels of strategic management, or 3 main levels of a firm. And those 3 levels are your corporate level, your business unit, business level or divisional level, that's all the same thing, and your functional level. And there are different parties and actors at each one of those levels. And you can read more in depth about what the activities are, who the main players are that you'll see at each one of those levels. I want to make sure that you got the main concept. And then lastly, what I wanted to go over is that there is a formal strategic planning process. There's always obviously going to be some deviation depending upon the manner with which general managers want to tackle this. But the formal strategic planning process should include the steps that we are going to go over now. The first thing that you should do is after you write this business model, then you're going to select or develop your corporate mission and goals. And then what you're going to do is you're going to analyze the external competitive environment, which will involve you identifying opportunities and threats. Then what you're going to do is you're going to analyze the internal operating environment. You're going to engage in what we call internal analysis. That's where you're going to look at all the things that you have, your resources, your capabilities, all the things that are within the firm that can enable the firm to achieve competitive advantage. And then what you're going to do is you're going to select organizational strategies that build on strengths and that correct weaknesses and that are consistent with this mission and the major goals. This is, again, why you develop those on the front end of the strategic planning process, and that are congruent and that constitute a viable business model. That's why you have to write one. And then, of course, you're going to implement the strategies. There's some really good images that are provided with the particular textbook that that I've selected for you this semester. The strategic planning process has got an illustrative model, which you can see on the screen here. And it's useful for you conceiving of how all of this works together. And when we talk about the strategic planning process, we have essentially covered what will be in your textbook as well, because what we are going to do is we're going to talk about, and we have talked about to some extent in this chapter already, we've talked about developing a business model, its relevance to firm strategy. We talk about mission, vision, values, and goals, and we've talked about who the key players are that are responsible for implementing strategy and those who are responsible for developing it. And that's all about strategic leadership. And so that was chapter 1. In chapter 2, we're going to go over external analysis, where we look at things outside of a firm that can affect its ability to achieve competitive advantage. Because remember, that's the end goal of strategy making. Whenever you hear me ask you, what is the end goal of strategy making, the strategy development, and even strategy implementation, it is the achievement of competitive advantage, which is, again, not when you could do something better than somebody else, not when your marketing strategies are better than other companies, not when your brand is more well known, even though all of those things can lend themselves to a firm achieving competitive advantage. Remember, competitive advantage is when your firm's profitability is greater than the average profitability of other firms in your industry. That's competitive advantage. It's measurable. Okay, we're going to look at chapter 3 at internal analysis. So you're going to look at the things within a firm that can enable it to achieve competitive advantage, resources, capabilities. Then chapter 4, we're going to look at functional level strategies, right? So we talked about what the 3 levels are of a firm, and we know that the corporate level is where you develop strategy. We know that the business unit level also is where you'll see some strategy development happening, but we know that the functional level is where you have all of these managers that are responsible for the specific value chain functions that allow the firm to transform an input into a valuable output. So we're going to look at the functional level strategies that a firm can employ to achieve competitive advantage. In chapters 5, 6, and 7, we're going to specifically look at some business unit and divisional level strategies that will, we're going to look at the strategies that firms can implement at that level of the firm in order for that firm to achieve competitive advantage, right? So we're going to look at how your household chemicals division, how your commercial chemicals division, and maybe even your snack foods division, how each of them independently and then collectively can lend themselves to the firm overall achieving competitive advantage. We're going to look in chapter 8 at global strategies, which are important for really all of the levels of a firm, for a firm to achieve competitive advantage. We're going to look at corporate level strategies again in chapters 9 and 10. And this is when we're going to look at diversification and different strategies. And diversification is going to be when a firm is operating in multiple industries, or when a firm has got multiple business units. And so what we'll do is we'll talk about that in chapters 9 and 10. We're going to talk about corporate social responsibility in chapter 11 and ethics and business ethics and why they're relevant to a firm actually successfully achieving competitive advantage. Ethical issues almost always result in some sort of fiscal penalty for a firm. And so it's important to be ethical for that reason. Same thing with you as a business professional. Your commitment to business ethics, doing things that are right, being a good steward of the resources and the responsibility that you've been given will lend themselves to you not experiencing penalties throughout your career as well. So we're going to talk about your role in society as someone who is committed to corporate social responsibility and business ethics. We're going to talk about the role of organizational structure and the different structures that firms can take in chapter 12. And it'll help you understand how those structures themselves can lend themselves to firms achieving competitive advantage. And we're going to talk about organizational culture also in that same chapter, and then the control systems that you can put in place that can guide, incent, and correct the behavior of the actors within your firm in order to ensure that you can achieve competitive advantage. So really interesting things that we're going to cover. I've just done a summary of chapter 1 for you and of strategic leadership. And I am looking forward to working with you throughout the semester. Make sure that you also read the full chapter for chapter 1, answer the Cengage assignments, and any other assignments that I've also given you, which you can see in your syllabus schedule of assignments. Have a great day, guys. I will see you in next class.